Thank you, Center for Diaspora Studies, for inviting me. And thank you, Dr. Jayakumar, particularly for inviting me. And it was his invitation that actually sparked this idea that I'm going to be talking about today. So thank you so much. It's something that I've been thinking for a while. It's just never came to it. So I appreciate that push. So what I'm going to be talking about is something new. So your feedback is really essential. I'm going to use the PowerPoint minimally, and if I forget to say next slide, it's not the end of the world. We'll manage. I have everything here, so it's fine. All right, so the goal today is to think about what it means to be Indian and American. And the case that I'm going to use on this point is Sikh American. So Dr. Jayakumar, next slide, please. So the case that I'm going to be focusing on are Sikh Americans, and I believe it's an important question to ask, what it means to be Indian and American in light of tremendous diversity within the group. So as the slide shows, diversity exists on account of religion, Hindus, then Muslims, Roman Catholic, Protestant, Jain, Sikh, etc., all in that order of proportions in which it appears in the population. In terms of region, Gujaratis topping the list, followed by Maharashtrians, those from Andhra Pradesh, Tamil Nadu, Delhi, and Kerala. And Indian Americans speak many languages too. So most people speak Hindi in the United States, followed by Gujarati, English, Telugu, Tamil, Punjabi, Bengali, Malayalam, Urdu, Marathi, Kannada, etc. So there's a great variety, again in that same order. And then there's also social class variety as well. Although Indian Americans have the highest median household income. In fact, it's over 100,000, but there is a population that is impoverished. And interestingly, as I was preparing for this, what I found is that the impoverished among the Indians are likely to be men. They're less likely to be American citizens. And interestingly for me, because it speaks to both parts of my identity, they're also likely to be Bengali and Punjabi, which I thought was quite interesting. But here, the Bengali Punjabi might also be capturing people from Bangladesh and Pakistan as well. So that's something to keep in mind. So it is in this context, next slide please, that I ask the following questions. How do the immigrants from India experience and or relate to being Indian in light of this tremendous intra-group diversity? And what do we learn about the social location and identity formation of Indian immigrants in the United States, right? The data that I'm going to be talking about is drawn from my own work on Sikh Americans over the years. One set of data is from my ongoing research on Sikh Americans that comprises those of all socioeconomic backgrounds. It includes semi-structured interviews with the immigrants, ethnographic observations like at the gurdwaras, various community events like this one. This is the annual event that's held at the gurdwaras in New Jersey, at least, the annual Gatka event. Next slide, please. Annual Sikh Day Parade, and various other types of community events. And this is the photograph of me working in the kitchen at this Gurudas temple, actually. It's logging after over like, I was making rotis in the langar hall, I had been going there for a while, so I felt good that I was invited to actually do that. So I felt honored to be able to join that inner circle of people. And there are also photographs that I've taken. I'm a photography enthusiast, usually have my camera with me, and these days, all you need is a phone. So I also have some visual material, although only have a couple or few for today's presentation. I'm going to draw from my previous work on Sikh American cab drivers in New York City. And all the names that I'm going to mention here are pseudonyms. Next slide, please. So these are the questions that I've already mentioned. Next slide, please. So the way that I've organized the presentation for today is to talk about the various points of convergence and divergence in the lived experiences of Sikh Americans. And then I'm going to conclude with discussing its meaning for being Indian and American, and think about some ways forward for research and also my work as well. So what are some of the questions that are coming to me as I'm thinking through this? So your feedback is really important in that regard. So based on my research, there are 4 points along which informants diverged and converged. Socioeconomic status, memory and trauma of 1984, experiences of racism, as well as identification with this thing that I call Punjabiness. So to begin looking at the data, starting with socioeconomic status, or social class, there are 4 points also within that category that are noteworthy to reflect on in terms of the socioeconomic differences among Sikh Americans. Their methods of entry into the United States, their choice of profession and experience in the profession, their choice of neighborhood in which they lived, and there are a few other miscellaneous distinctions that I found to be fascinating. So now, with regard to their method of entry, next slide, please. With regard to their method of entry, the Sikh immigrants of low socioeconomic status mostly entered without proper documentation or without any documentation at all. The strategies used to enter the US was by crossing undocumented from Canada or Mexico, arriving on tourist visas, which lapsed, and then they would figure out ways of legalizing their status. Visas could also have been obtained fraudulently as well, also jumping ships, and that usually works where the ship docks at the port. Usually, from what I gathered from the respondents, that you're given a pass to kind of a day pass to kind of do whatever you want to do during the day. And then at the end, you're actually supposed to return to the ship. And sometimes people just did not return. And this is in 2000. So this is pre 9/11 and pre all this digitization of documentation, where some of the respondents also arrived disguised as somebody else. So, the agents in the black market would get the passport from somebody, disguise the respondent according to that photograph, and then that's how they would enter the US. And a very small proportion of the low SES people arrived on student visas, maybe 2 or 3, if I remember correctly. And legalization was done through various provisions of the immigration laws, or what the informants called paper marriage. So you pay somebody, a native-born citizen, they marry you in exchange for permanent residency. It's illegal, of course, but and those are really expensive. In 2008-9, when I interviewed this one guy, he said it was $25,000. I bet it is way more today. In contrast to the low socioeconomic background informants, the professional immigrants, and perhaps even as predictable, arrived through legal means. So either as students, through marriage with a citizen, through professional work, which was another way. And so the professional choice for each group was partly dependent on their method of entry, where the former group, meaning those of low socioeconomic background, felt constrained by their status in this country and said that this was the only job that was flexible with regard to documentation. And for the professional group, the employment was consistent with their educational backgrounds. So usually, whatever they studied, they got the jobs in that field. So their career choices also appeared more planned prior to migration, especially for those who arrived on student visas or professional work visas. But I'll come back to that point a bit later. So let's think about the work experience for now. For the cabbies, class was a constant, you can just keep it here. The class was a constant source of marginalization as they drove in New York City. Just to read a couple of excerpts, they felt disrespected. And as one driver said, and all the interviews were conducted in either Hindustani or Punjabi, and then mostly English with the professional informants. So as one driver says, and I'm translating, many people don't respect us. No one addresses us as sir. They call us driver. We respond with yes, passenger. They get mad. They want an explanation for calling them passenger, but they don't realize that I call them passenger because they address me as driver. Another one believed that the driver status is low in society. We make good money, but that doesn't really matter. Or even though we behave well, our status in society is still very low. people don't consider this, meaning driving taxis, to be a good profession. As drivers, people speak to us in a harsh way. Police don't listen to us, even when it's not our fault. We get tickets, etc., etc. And many of the drivers actually compared driving taxis to being a rickshaw puller in India, which I thought was interesting. And of course, the choice of occupation, the cabbies argued was, due to their poor education. Some argued that their degrees were from rural institutions. Their English language they had poor grasp of the language, and of course the lack of adequate documentation. And one cabbie said, 80% of the Punjabis are only college educated. In addition, their education is from rural areas, like there's Chandigarh College. I don't even know if there's a college like that. I know there's Chandigarh University. Basically, they're not as educated. It's only graduation. And you can't work on Wall Street or banks with that education. Those who have other jobs don't make as much, maybe $400. And somebody else pointed out that, your basic need is your paper, immigration papers. There are many people who are not pakka. They have social security number. They got a social security. They have their license and they're driving. Like some people have studied a little and can speak a little English. It's good. You can make money. They're easy. People who work because we don't have much to speak with the customer. But also what's important to note is that a couple of the drivers that I interviewed chose to drive as opposed to pursuing higher degrees, which I thought was also interesting. So for instance, Dusdeep, it's a pseudonym, whom I interviewed, was cognizant of the stigma associated with driving taxis and was aware of poor educational qualifications, which pushed many to drive, still decided against pursuing a college degree, as did his friend. So it would seem that, to me, that despite knowing the low rank of driving taxis, their choice for taxis was connected to a favorable view of the occupation within the community. It seems like it was a norm that operated within the community. So, but what's really interesting, while talking to me, many of the cabbies wanted to impress upon me by talking about the expensive neighborhoods in which they live. One said, I live in a very expensive neighborhood, and how they define the very expensive neighborhood is also quite fascinating. There's no more than 2% Indians and taxi drivers, maybe even less than 1% of those who live here, right? So kind of distancing oneself from people you associate as stigmatized because of social class. So it appears that the drivers were aware of the dual norms that guided their lives. One that made driving taxis acceptable. The other was the one that shaped, they knew there were larger social norms that stigmatized driving. So I do wonder that as I was talking to them, the extent to which their response was an effect of my perceived class, where he presumed that I viewed driving taxis as less prestigious in the society. So maybe it was important, therefore, for him to let me know that not all aspects of his life were bound by his low socioeconomic status, of which, driving taxis was one indicator. Now, the professional immigrants' class consciousness was manifest in different ways. One respondent, who was a dentist, in fact, was very direct about her view of those who immigrate. She said, my mentality at the time was that the only people who from my family who came here were not educated, and that's what I thought at the time. She thought so because her cousins who had arrived to America before her were cab drivers. Contrary to her father, whom she proudly said, was a professional and raised her as a professional as well. Pride was another way in which the professionals' class consciousness showed up. To give you an example from one of the interviews, and then we'll walk back to contextualize it a little bit. So I asked the interviewee, and your father, in the context, and your father, is that all he did? He was just a farmer, or did he? And before even I could finish my sentence, he jumps in and says, no, he was a civil engineer. My mom was an English lecturer. So, they were really nice affluent jobs. I mean, it is our land. So I was asking about how much land they had in Punjab. So my grandfather, it came from my great grandfather to grandfather. So basically we just possessed it, and that's how we kept it. So now I realized this later, a little bit of thought about myself, that when I asked him, was his father just a farmer? This is how he responded, right? So he could have challenged my presumed judgment of being just a farmer, but he did not. Instead, he responded by explaining the professional jobs that his parents had. In fact, he asserted that, they were very affluent. And Gurpreet himself works in information tech sector. He's an engineer. He's earned an MBA from a well-known American institution. He was working from home during the coronavirus pandemic, and it's ongoing and it's raging at the moment. It was an experience quite contrary to the two respondents this time that I talked to, who were taxi drivers. And I talked to them 5-6 years ago as well. They had, in fact, lost their income. They were relying on government unemployment support. And one of them was working with his brother-in-law as an electrician to supplement that support that he was receiving from the government. So very different work experience. So other ways in which class differences showed up was in the form of technology use, which I thought was interesting. So the professional immigrants were very comfortable with using Skype or Zoom. Probably they use it for work. And those of the low SES were more comfortable with WhatsApp. Language spoken was different. Interviews with professional immigrants were, conducted, as I said, mostly in English. Gurpreet, for instance, was very clear that he wanted to speak in English, even though I'd given him 2 other options. And even when I would slide into, another language, mostly in Hindustani, he wouldn't respond. He would stick with English. Whereas, Hindi or Hindustani or Punjabi were the languages in which the interviews were conducted with the people of low SES. In fact, one of them even, preferred to speak in Punjabi. And finally, the Gurdwara arrangement was really, really different. Just to give you a couple of examples, I thought it was fascinating, where in the professional immigrant, Gurdwaras, you would see like the tea and the sugar kept separately. Whereas in the Gurdwara, where at least the 2 that I frequently visited, and maybe I shouldn't generalize, the tea and where mostly people of low SES, or that I define as low SES, attended, the tea and the sugar were actually, mixed in, which I thought was quite interesting difference, and there were aesthetics in terms of the clothing, etc. So despite this difference, there was an important point of convergence among the Sikh immigrants, and that was on the basis of the memory and trauma of 1984. So Harmanjot, who's a dentist, talks about 1984 when she was in India. She grew up in Jamshedpur, actually. So, when 1984 happened in India, my brother was in high school. All of a sudden, he was a bad kid. He was punished every day. The teachers took it out on him. And then she goes on to say, I remember thinking, if they come to kill my family, am I going to fight them? Or will I give them, give in because they were raping girls, killing them? I'm going to fight them. I'm not giving up easily, but because of the age I was, my family was really politically aware also. It left a deep impact on me. Gurpreet, the guy who was on the information technology, he says, so I was born at the time when there was a movement going on in Punjab, where, again, only the Sikhs were targeted. They were killed, they were oppressed. Like, why are we targeted? Why? I mean, if anybody else does something, they're pardoned, but then anybody from my clan does it, we're targeted. Similarly, Gulshan Singh, a cab driver, recounted similar feelings of trauma and disenchantment, I think, with India. He says, the problem was regarding Khalistan. Our community there wanted some autonomy, some power. There was some friction in the service jobs. Sikhs were having trouble getting jobs. There was discrimination against people from our community. That's why we wanted more power for our state. That's why the violence began. There was a high employment, guns were being used. I've only worked in the police department there. I was also from the Sikh community. That's why I quit. 1984 also finds its voice in the annual Sikh Day parades, which is not the case in the annual India Day parade celebrated around India's Independence Day on August 15th. And as Shruti Devgan, who's done extensive work on trauma of 1984, also a sociologist, says that, talks about how this is a continuity of experience of othering for Sikh immigrants. So one informant kind of resonates her point. She talks about her experience of school in India. She said, we had a social studies teacher. It was 7th grade teacher, I think so. When she would teach, she would say that India is for Hindus. Sikhs or Muslims who live here will be pushed out. And then she says, goes on at another point, says, I was in Delhi then. Then when I came to Chandigarh, I had a Hindu friend who would say that this is Hindustan. It's for Hindus. I would say that now I'm in Punjab, so then Hindus shouldn't live here. These small things, even here people will say things I just ignore. There was also another point of convergence, the general affinity with being Punjabi, including with people across the border, which united the Sikh immigrants that I spoke to. So the cabbies, for instance, congregated at various eateries around Manhattan. And the ones frequented by the Sikh cabbies that I at least attended, I pretty much covered all of the dhabas in Manhattan. They were also frequented by Pakistani cabbies, and presumably they are Punjabi as well. And there was also an expansive Sikh identity that connected to Pakistan as well, given that Guru Nanak was born there. And one of the professional immigrants said that, I feel more connected to Pakistan than with India. And there was a disavowal for some of the Indian identity by a few of the professional immigrants that I spoke to, and some connected it with the trauma of 1984. And of course, racism was another point of convergence for the immigrants. Being subject to racism was routine for the cabbies. So, one thought that the police are really racist when they're stopped on the street while they're driving. So they deal with you whether you're black, white, or brown. They mostly favor whites. Another driver thought that, the whites don't really say anything, but if you notice the little things, then you can tell that they don't say directly that they don't want your cab because you are Asian, but the way they talk with you and how they treat you is an indication. And there are countless accounts of racism on the streets of New York that the cabbies, expressed that they experienced. In fact, they thought that their lower socioeconomic status also predisposed them to bad behavior from passengers, police, and other people, involved in the taxi business. And this experience of racism resonated with the professional immigrants as well. Manjot, the dentist I mentioned, really had an incident with when she was at a home improvement store to buy things. She had gone there with her husband and children, and she said, there was a big white bald guy with a truck, looked like a blue collar guy. He kept glaring and glaring and glaring at my husband and me for some reason. I have the radar, okay? My husband will never pick. He's a very, very calm person, non-confrontational, very gentle. But I used to be walking with him, and I would glare back at the guy. Don't you dare stare at my family like that. That was my stance. I had to do it. But I also think that the socioeconomic background of the professional class allowed them to ignore the racism experience. So another dentist, Mona, I'm not going to read. It's a pretty long, because I forgot to add the slide with the excerpt. But the gist of it is that she also talks about experiencing racism, and her husband's also a doctor. But she says, maybe not, because he's at another level, at a higher level, and so, he can ignore it now. And then she says, we are employers ourselves, because she has her own practice. She's self-employed as a dentist. So she's in a position of power vis-a-vis her white workers, and so then it allows her to ignore the racism as a result. And interestingly, the cabbies that I interviewed invoked the prestige of the middle-class Indian Americans as a way to elevate their own social status. Arshdeep, for example, said, so, it's not racism, but it's more like they feel like we make them feel low. 80% doctors are from India. A lot of doctors and engineers are from India. They are jealous. They don't care much about skin color or about being light color. They don't want others to see their weaknesses. If there's one white and one Indian, the Indian will be promoted first, and so that'll anger whites. that's not true, because the racism shows that there's discrimination in the market that is the exact opposite. But she thinks, yeah, that's going to happen. And the Indian is the hard worker. We work hard, and they're not capable, so it just bothers them. And I suppose for the same reason, one of the owners of one of the dhabas that I would visit in Manhattan expressed surprise and pride when he learned that. He said, "Oh, what do you do?" So I said, "This is what I do." He said, "Oh, you teach white people." Although I'm neither Punjabi nor Sikh. And they also, the informants, professional class, or the lower SES people, they made a link between African Americans' crime and laziness. It was a way to kind of assert themselves as superior. And this is, again, how the two socioeconomic groups met. And the cabbies in particular, though, made a distinction between foreign-born and native-born blacks. They saw themselves as part of the entire group of immigrants in America, regardless of race. And the immigrant consciousness is probably a consequence of being treated as such, being told, go back to your country, for example. So there was an awareness of being outsiders to the society. And one driver thought, he actually came in his early 40s. He crossed over to the US from Canada. He thought, if you're an immigrant, you cannot get a job quickly unless you're highly qualified. Otherwise, you have to wait one generation to get a better job. The next generation can pick it up and become a doctor or an engineer, and that's what they all hope that their children will become. The first generation has to work hard. And this is where, again, I said there's overlap with the professional immigrants. And as one said, and this guy has a PhD in physics. He worked for a major telecommunications company. He's retired, and as a retiree, he teaches adjunct in a local college. Says, I guess, when you grow up in a culture in a country, that it leaves a very strong impression on you, and that never goes away. No matter how long I live in America, I never quite feel that I'm part of this country or this community, and I like America, I like US, and I think there's a lot that the country has to offer, and I'm glad that I live in the USA, but I don't think I can identify myself with the American ethos as much as I can with, things that I have been part of my childhood and growth. And so while the immigrant ethos between the different classes doesn't manifest in the same way, but it still does. So what are the takeaways from this? So if we could go to the slide with the takeaways. Yeah, if you just stop it there. So this is what I'm getting from it at the moment, that clearly there are points of convergence and divergence. There's points of divergence on account of socioeconomic status and caste. There's some narrative about caste distinctions, and because I don't explore it in great depth, I have it in my paper, but I didn't talk about it here. And there are points of convergence around the memory and trauma of 1984. There's this Punjabiness or this regionalness, and then as feeling together as a result of being non-white and being a foreigner. What is also interesting is that there is evidence of this model minority ethos as well. The model minority is a racial construct of Asian Americans, including Indian Americans in the United States. They're constructed as better than blacks in particular, but not as high up, equal as whites, to put it in a nutshell. I can explain it more later if somebody has a question about the context of when this came about. But also what is important to remember is that Sikhs experience a different kind of racism, which Dave Gunn calls embodied identity, where the physical representation of the religion makes them other. The turban, the beard, etc. There's also a disavowal of Indian identity, and it seems, based on what I have, that's mediated by socioeconomic status, whereby the lower socioeconomic status informants were not as vocal about it, contrary to those who were in the professional class. Whether this is a pattern, is something for future researchers to explore. And then compared to white ethnics, so white ethnics, again, are people who are not of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant background, who immigrated to the country mostly in the 19th century. So people from, Italy, Poland, Ireland, etc. And they were initially seen as not white. So compared to the white ethnics, we don't see an universal homogeneous formation of an Indian identity, which happened with the white ethnics as the 20th century rolled forward. They all learned to see themselves as white. Their internal differences of the I'm Irish, I'm Italian kind of dissipated in significance. There's intermarriage, et cetera, et cetera. They were gradually subsumed within the category of white, which I think played a role in kind of letting go of those ethnic differences. But for the Sikh Americans, the Indian American identity is not a majority identity like the white identity. So that's another point to explore, that, and I'm not sure we can ever find this out, that if Indian American was a majority identity that was accessible to Sikh immigrants, would one see within group distinction continue the way we do? So for now, all really I can say is that the Indian is more a descriptor rather than necessarily an identity that all Sikhs accept unquestioningly. And the last slide, please. So finally, I just want to say is that research on immigrants for the future need to look at the majority and minority relations prior to migration, must be considered in understanding identity formation in the place to which immigration has occurred. It's also significant for shedding light on the quality of diaspora involvement in the place of origin, and an intersectional analysis is an absolute must in achieving a fuller picture of immigrant identity formation. It also questions, these very essentialist ideas of classification, identities, and racial explanations. And so there, this just shows more evidence of the social construction of race, that these facile categories, and we assume that, they all make sense to the people who are classified as such. It doesn't necessarily do that either. And that's really all I want to say. Thank you so much for listening.